She rolled her eyes every time he opened the door. But when her son was trapped in a burning car, the man she mocked became the only one who ran toward the flames. The morning light on Parkside Avenue always arrived with a hush, soft golden beams cutting through the sharp glass lines of the high-rise apartment buildings. Among them stood the Langston, a luxury complex that whispered wealth without ever having to shout it, and stationed just beyond its polished revolving doors stood Walter. Walter was a black man in his early 60s, his hair graying at the temples, his uniform always crisp, his back straight and his eyes quietly alert. He wore time like a well-tailored coat, weathered but dignified. Residents described him as reliable, polite, and always knows your name, even your dog's birthday. But they rarely knew more. Walter kept the rest of himself tucked away, like the pocket-sized notebook he carried in his coat. He had worked the door for nearly 20 years. Through heat waves, blizzards and blackouts, Walter never missed a shift. He greeted each tenant with the same warmth, a gentle nod, a good morning ma'am or sir, and the occasional umbrella held high over a hurried guest's head. Most appreciated him, some barely noticed. Victoria Langford noticed, though not kindly. A woman in her early 40s, Victoria walked with the unshakable confidence of someone used to owning the room before entering it. She was immaculate, designer coats, sunglasses worn even on cloudy days, and a voice with just enough sugar to mask the venom. To her, Walter wasn't Walter. He was simply the doorman, an invisible fixture, like the marble tiles beneath her stilettos. "Still reading those little books of yours?" She once asked, not bothering to hide the sneer in her voice as she walked past him. "Yes, ma'am," Walter replied, smile never faltering, hand tipping his cap out of habit. "Helps the time pass kindly." She scoffed, disappearing into the elevator before he could finish the sentence. But Walter never changed. He didn't shrink from her bitterness, nor did he return it. He simply stood, like always, steady, observant, and waiting for the next moment to be of service. It was only Ethan, her 16-year-old son, who ever seemed to look at Walter differently. Ethan was tall for his age, with messy hair that always needed brushing and earbuds forever hanging from his collar. He didn't say much, but he always nodded when he saw Walter, sometimes even pausing to ask what he was reading. "Poetry today," Walter once told him, holding up a dog-eared book. "Langston. Hughes, ever heard of him?" Ethan shook his head. "Well," Walter smiled, "maybe I'll lend you this one day." Their conversations were brief, light, but in those small exchanges Walter could tell. The boy noticed what his mother never did, and so each Sunday to Saturday Walter remained, holding doors, offering umbrellas, smiling through storms of weather and of people. Because some jobs required more than a uniform, they required grace. And Walter? Walter had grace in abundance, even when no one was watching. Evenings at the Langston carried a different rhythm. The lobby, once filled with rushed footsteps and elevator chimes, now glowed under soft lights and hushed conversations. Residents returned from dinner reservations or rooftop parties, their laughter echoing off the marble. And Walter stood quietly, still at his post, like a sentinel who'd never been relieved of duty. But not all evenings were kind. In the hazy recollection of cocktail chatter and clinking glasses, Victoria Langford often held court among her guests. Dressed in satin and pearls, she was the type who could humiliate someone with elegance. "I swear, every time I walk past he's reading some worn-out book," she once said at a gathering held in the building's private lounge. Her manicured fingers curled around a wine glass, her voice loud enough to carry. "We've got ourselves a doorman philosopher." A few laughed, awkwardly. A few looked down, unsure how to respond. But Victoria smiled wider, feeding off the discomfort. "What do you suppose he writes in that little notebook? Sonnets about elevators and revolving doors?" Walter heard it. Everyone knew he had. But he didn't flinch. Instead, the next morning, he held the door open for her as always. "Good morning, Ms. Langford." She didn't respond. Walter's colleagues had noticed the way she treated him. Some, like Maria, the night supervisor, would shake their heads. "You've got the patience of a saint, Walter," she said once during a slow midnight shift. "I don't know how you do it." Walter smiled, tapping the corner of his worn notebook. "Grace is cheaper than bitterness, and lasts longer." What few people knew, even among the staff, was that Walter sometimes filled those notebooks with poetry. Simple, beautiful verses, fragments of memory, reflections on city life. He wrote during his breaks, sitting on the bench near the service entrance, letting the rhythm of traffic and footsteps guide his thoughts. It wasn't for publication. It was just his way of breathing through the noise. And yet someone did see Ethan. More than once the boy had come home to find his mother's sharp tongue on display, mocking Walter's posture, his book, even his choice of shoes. And each time Ethan stood off to the side, shoulders tense, jaw clenched. He never spoke up, but he didn't laugh either. He simply stared, eyes darting between Walter and Victoria, as if trying to untangle something that didn't make sense to him. Once, after an especially cruel remark from Victoria, Ethan lingered in the lobby long after she disappeared upstairs. "You ever think about quitting?" he asked Walter, voice barely above a whisper. Walter looked up from his notebook. "Every day," he said with a half-smile. "But I think about staying even." "More," Ethan gave a small nod, then walked away. And in that silence, Walter sensed what Victoria never could, that the boy was watching, listening, learning. Because sometimes it's not the loudest voices that shape us, it's the quiet ones who endure. Beyond the polished brass doors of Parkside Avenue's luxury high-rise, Walter's life was quieter, but far richer than anyone in that marble lobby ever knew. Each night, when his shift ended and the buzz of elevators faded behind him, Walter took the subway back to Harlem, to a modest brownstone walk-up with creaky stairs and warm, familiar shadows. His apartment was small but tidy, filled with books that leaned into one another like old friends. On the windowsill sat a thriving plant he called Patience, a gift from a kid at the community center he volunteered at every Saturday, because when Walter wasn't holding doors for Manhattan's elite, he was holding space for kids who had none. The youth center on 137th Street knew him simply as Mr. Walter. He ran writing workshops for teenagers, encouraging them to speak their truth with ink-stained fingers. Some of those kids came from shelters, some from broken homes, but all of them left his class feeling heard. He never talked about his job as a doorman. Here he wasn't staff. He was a mentor, a storyteller, a guide. Years ago, before the school, budget cuts and principal turnovers, Walter had been an English teacher. The kind students came back to visit long after graduation, but when the district closed the school due to low performance and turned the building into luxury condos, Walter found himself out of work at 52, too old in the eyes of new administrators, too proud to beg. So he put on a uniform, took a job and never stopped teaching, just changed the classroom. At home, inside a weathered shoebox tucked beneath his bed, were the pieces of a life no one ever asked about. Folded letters, Polaroid photos, a pressed daisy. Keepsakes from his late wife, Delilah. They met in college, fell in love over poetry slams and midnight jazz, and were inseparable for 28 years. Her photo sat in a brass frame beside his reading chair, Delilah with her soft eyes and crooked smile, wearing the dress he bought her with his first paycheck. She had been gone 7 years now, claimed by cancer that moved faster than medicine. Walter still talked to her sometimes, especially when the nights were too quiet or the world too heavy. And there was one story even his closest friends didn't. No, years ago, long before Parkside Avenue and fancy uniforms, Walter had been waiting for a train when a man stumbled off the platform. People screamed, froze. But Walter, without thinking, jumped down and pulled the man to safety seconds before the train thundered in. He never gave his name, didn't wait for a thank you, just dusted himself off and disappeared into the crowd. Because bravery to Walter wasn't a performance. It was instinct, and it didn't need applause. Back at the high-rise, Victoria Langford rolled her eyes at his reading habits. Residents sometimes passed him without a word, But Walter had lived 1,000 lives beyond those glass doors, and he carried them all in the quiet way he walked, in the steady way he watched, and in the way he never let the world's cruelty strip him of kindness. He was a man with a broken heart, a full soul, and a spine made of quiet steel. And soon, that strength, unseen by many, would be the difference between life and death. It was just after 7 a.m. on a chilly Thursday when Walter began his shift like he always did, buttoning his uniform with care, adjusting his name tag, and tipping his cap to the rising sun. The city was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes. Delivery trucks hummed in the distance. A light wind stirred fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Walter stood at the front entrance of the Parkside building, sipping his coffee, when he noticed something strange. A faint black thread of smoke, curling upward across the street. He squinted. Parked near the curb was a luxury sedan, one of the residents' cars, but the name escaped him. Then the smoke thickened, no longer a wisp, but a warning. His heartbeat quickened. That's when he saw a silhouette inside. Walter set his coffee down, walked closer. His stomach dropped. Inside the vehicle, slumped across the passenger seat, was Ethan, Victoria Langford's son. His head lolled to the side, mouth slightly open, eyes shut. The boy wasn't moving. Walter ran. In seconds, he was at the car, pounding on the glass. "Ethan!" he shouted. No response. The smoke was thicker now, and flames flickered beneath the hood. The door wouldn't budge, jammed from the inside. Without hesitation, Walter yanked off his blazer, wrapped it around his fist, and smashed the passenger window with a grunt that tore from his chest. Glass scattered like sharp confetti. He reached in, coughing from the smoke, and grabbed Ethan by the collar, pulling him over the center console with a strength fueled by panic and purpose. Just as he dragged the boy free, the engine gave a sharp, violent pop, and the car burst into flames behind them. Walter didn't stop. He carried Ethan in his arms like a wounded soldier, staggering away from the heat, glass still embedded in his palm, soot streaking his cheeks. The first bystanders arrived, phones out, filming in. Stunned silence. Sirens began to scream from blocks away. Then came Victoria, heels clacking furiously against the pavement, face pale, eyes wide. She froze as she saw the scene before her. Her son, limp and coughing, held in the arms of the man she had mocked. For years, their eyes met, Walter's full of smoke and strain, hers of disbelief and shame. I didn't know, she whispered, voice cracking. But Walter didn't wait for thanks. He laid Ethan gently onto the sidewalk, checked his pulse, and stepped back to let the paramedics take over. Blood ran from a deep cut on his hand. His shirt was torn. But he stood, tall, eyes never leaving Ethan until the boy gave a weak cough. "Alive," the crowd murmured. Some applauded. Cameras kept rolling. But Walter? He just turned back toward the building, silent and steady, as always. Except everything had changed. By the next morning, Walter's face was everywhere, though he had never wanted it to be. Front-page headlines read, "Doorman saves teen from exploding car. Hero walks away without a word." Clips of him pulling Ethan from the burning vehicle, looped endlessly on local news. A slow-motion still of his soot-covered face, eyes focused and jaw clenched, had already gone viral online. "The quiet hero of Parkside Avenue," one commentator called him. But Walter stayed silent. When reporters camped outside the building, crowding the sidewalk with cameras and microphones, he simply nodded politely and kept walking. He declined every interview request, told the building manager to remind everyone he was just doing his job. He even took a few days off, not because he needed rest, but because he couldn't stand the noise. Inside apartment 9B, Victoria. Langford sat by her son's bedside, stunned. Ethan was recovering, bruised ribs, mild smoke inhalation, but he was expected to be fine. Her perfectly polished world, however, was not fine. She had rehearsed a dozen speeches, tried to practice gratitude in the mirror, but when she finally saw Walter again, standing in the quiet lobby, straightening a delivery clipboard, She froze. I wanted to thank you, she said, voice thin. Walter looked up from his papers, expression unreadable. Of course. Ma'am, I was glad I was there. That was all. Victoria stared at him, the same way one might study a stranger they realized they should have known better. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Upstairs, Ethan had no such hesitation. He texted Walter directly. You saved my life. Can you come see me? Walter hesitated for a full hour before replying. Then he knocked softly at the Langfords' door, stepping into a room filled with awkwardness and gratitude. Ethan grinned, pale but energetic. I knew you were more than you let on, he said. Walter smiled faintly. You always noticed more than most. Victoria stood in the corner, arms folded, an unfamiliar tightness around her eyes. She watched the quiet exchange between her son and the man she had dismissed for years, and something inside her cracked, not broken, not yet, but fractured, as if the certainty she carried about people and their place in the world had just become less solid, less convenient, and, in that silence, as her son laughed with the man who had saved his life, she realized she had never really seen Walter at all. A few days later, Walter returned to work as quietly as he had left it. The cameras were gone now. The doorman's desk was just a desk again. No more whispered praise in the hallway or awkward nods from neighbors who'd barely looked at him before. Walter preferred it this way, normalcy restored. But tucked beneath the stack of mail and resident memos at his post was a cream-colored envelope with his name scrawled in a teenager's looping print. He opened it slowly, not expecting much. Inside was a handwritten note, carefully penned on lined notebook paper. Dear Mr. Walter, you've seen me more than most people ever have. You always greeted me like I mattered, even when my own mother barely noticed me. You didn't just save my life last week. You made me feel like I was worth saving. I'll never forget what you did. Ethan. Walter stared at the words for a long time. His breath caught in his throat. He folded the paper slowly and held it in his palm as if it were made of glass. He didn't cry, not exactly, but his eyes welled, and he sat in stillness with that rare, aching feeling that only comes when a person realizes they've finally been seen. That evening, as twilight washed soft amber tones across the marble floors of the building's lobby, Victoria Langford stepped in. No heels, no lipstick, no shield of superiority. Just a tired mother in flats and a cardigan, her hair pulled back, her eyes softer than usual. She approached slowly, then stopped in front of him. I owe you more than I can ever say, she said, voice low and steady. But I wanted to start with this. She held out a small rectangular package, wrapped in brown paper with a burgundy ribbon. No tag. Walter took it carefully and began unwrapping. Inside was a worn but well-kept first-edition copy of Langston Hughes' poetry collection. The pages had that familiar warm paper scent, like a distant memory. I found the poem in your locker, she added. Ethan showed me. I didn't know you wrote. Walter looked up, surprised. His hands hovered over the book like it might disappear. It's beautiful, she said simply. You have a gift. For the first time in years, Walter didn't know what to say. The woman who once mocked his reading now stood before him, not with pity, but with quiet respect. And for a moment the weight of years lifted, just enough for two people, once worlds apart, to meet in the middle of shared humanity. Days passed. The building on Parkside Avenue seemed to breathe differently. The marble floors no longer echoed with the stiff silence that once followed Walter's footsteps. Now, there were quiet nods, small gestures, a good morning here, a thank you there, nothing extravagant but sincere. And on one unusually still afternoon, as the golden light pooled through the lobby windows, Walter found himself sitting across from Victoria Langford. Not by arrangement, just by shared timing and something unspoken drawing them to pause. For a while they sat in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy, just thoughtful. Then, in a tone as even as his posture, Walter spoke, not out of bitterness, but truth. I used to teach English literature, he said, eyes fixed on a distant spot beyond the glass. Bronx Community College, before the budget cuts came down hard. Victoria turned toward him slowly, blinking as if the image of him, Walter the doorman, was now layered with something she hadn't wanted to see before. I didn't know, she said softly. Walter chuckled under his breath. Most don't ask. Her lips parted like she might say more, but she didn't. Not then. Apologies are fragile things, and the best ones come wrapped not in words but in action. That weekend, Victoria showed up at the neighborhood board meeting, a place where decisions were made about staff schedules, maintenance budgets, and the invisible workforce of the building. Normally, she breezed past these things, but this time she stood. I want to propose an initiative, she said, firm and composed. Increased recognition for our staff, better wages, annual bonuses tied to years of service. They've earned it. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, and for the first time, Victoria Langford wasn't speaking for herself, but for someone she once refused to see. News spread, slowly at first. One by one, residents began to write Walter short notes. Some were typed, others handwritten on scraps of stationery. You carried more than packages. You carried dignity. Thank you for always remembering my father's name. It meant more than you knew. You deserve more than we gave you. Walter read them quietly during his break, tucked them into a folder without fanfare. But something in his shoulders softened. The kind of softening that comes from long-held tension finally easing. He hadn't needed their thanks. But being seen, that mattered. And as the tides shifted ever so gently in that once cold building, Walter remained at his post. Not changed, but finally recognized for what he had always been. A man of quiet strength, invisible to most, yet holding up the world. Around him, the late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the marble floors of the Parkside Avenue building. Walter stood in the lobby, back in uniform, his navy blazer pressed, cap slightly tilted, and gloves tucked neatly into his pocket. But today, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a young man, maybe in his 20s, nervous, eager, adjusting his new tie for the third time. Walter watched him with a gentle smile and patient eyes, offering tips not just about holding the door, but about holding space for people, even the ones who never think to say thank you. That tenant on 4B, Walter said, nodding toward the elevator. She pretends she's always in a rush, but she likes when you ask about her dog, the man in 9A. He doesn't talk much, but he leaves the best holiday tips, if you remember his birthday. The young doorman chuckled. You remember. All that? Walter only smiled. You don't work a door. You hold a memory for the building. Just then, the front doors opened. A boy. No, not a boy anymore. Ethan strode in with a duffel slung over his shoulder, a Columbia University lanyard around his neck, and that same quiet smile he always gave Walter. He paused just long enough to wave. I won't forget what you did, he said, loud enough for only Walter to hear. Walter nodded, heart steady, throat tight. Make us proud, son. As Ethan walked out into the waiting cab, the young doorman beside him turned. He's going to college? Walter replied. He already learned what matters. The last guests of the evening passed through. The lobby quieted. Outside, the hum of the city turned softer, warmer, as lights blinked on in windows above. Walter walked slowly to the door, keys in hand. The young doorman watched him, unsure whether he was supposed to help. Walter just gave him a look of calm reassurance. No rush. Some things take time. And then, with a practiced flick of his wrist, Walter turned the key in the lock one final time that night. The sound echoed gently down the corridor. Walter stood by the glass, hands folded behind his back as the city glowed behind him, brighter than it had in years.